a lot of anthropologists, a lot of school curriculums have this idea that human societies have made a kind of linear progress, and that history has been a kind of progression from an early kind of savage state towards more and more civilization. But in some ways, it's the opposite of that. In some ways, many indigenous cultures were superior or more sophisticated than modern day cultures. And certainly in terms of politics, that's the case, because anthropologists now agree that the earliest human societies were very egalitarian and very cooperative. And one way in which they maintained their equality was to ensure that alpha males or dominant people would not get into positions of power. So if any individual showed a really strong desire to take over the community, to become the leader figure, they would be ostracized from the community. They would be forced to leave, or the community would move away from that person. So that they were very aware of the danger of their egalitarian culture being disrupted by, power-seeking people.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. And we do this through online presentations and interviews with guest speakers, as well as classes and study groups, which you can find on our website. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. We are in our 20th year. We started in 2003. However, in 2020, we began recording our presentations on Zoom. We have now a little over 100 recordings. Our video recordings are viewable through our website. If you go to the video library at caritascenter.org, and also on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. So if you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, we really appreciate it. You can make a donation or become a member by going to our website and enjoy the benefits of membership or make a donation. And now let me introduce today's guest speaker. Steve Taylor, PhD, is the author of many best-selling books on psychology and spirituality, including Extraordinary Awakenings, The Leap, and Spiritual Science. His books have been published in 20 languages, and Eckhart Tolle has described his work as, quote, an important contribution to the shift in consciousness that is happening on our planet. Since 2012, he has appeared annually in Mind, Body, Spirit magazine's list of the 100 most spiritually influential living people. He's a senior lecturer and researcher in psychology at Leeds Beckett University. For a full list of his publications, including his new book, Disconnected, which I just finished yesterday and highly recommend. Highly recommend. It sheds so much light on the reasons for so many of the issues we face today. So it's called Disconnected, The Roots of Human Cruelty and How Connection Can Heal the World. And you can see all his books and publications on his website, which is Stephen with a V, Stephen M for Michael, Taylor.com. And so today, Steve will be talking about his new book, Disconnected. Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for coming today to join us with us.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me. Hello, hi, everybody. Good. I'm not sure. It's probably morning where most of you are. So good morning, good afternoon, whatever it may be. For me, it's almost evening. It's sort of 5 o'clock.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, great to be with you.
So would you, do you want to share your screen, or do
And
you want?
not yet. I'd like, if it's okay, I'd like to begin with a short meditation, if that's okay.
Sure,
Everybody?
sure.
Yeah. I'm also a poet, so I like to begin my talks with a short poem. So I'd like to
Okay.
begin by reading a poem, and then I'll lead you into a short meditation, if that's okay. And the poem and the meditation, they illustrate aspects of what I want to discuss in any case. So I want to discuss the power of connection and the equally destructive power of disconnection. My view has always been that essentially human beings are deeply interconnected. We share the same spiritual source. We're all manifestations of the same spiritual essence. But unfortunately, many of us fall into disconnection. And it's when we fall into disconnection that a lot of destructive behavior arises and a lot of suffering arises. But it's always possible, because we're essentially interconnected, because connection is our essential nature. It's always possible for us to return or to re-experience, to reattune to our connected nature. So that's what I'd like to do in this talk. That's what I tried to do in the book, which Gloria mentioned. But let me begin with a poem, which I sometimes use when I begin talks and workshops as a way of emptying our minds and as a way of encountering one another in a state of presence. Often when we meet people, we carry preconceptions, we carry intentions and other kinds of concepts. But to meet somebody truly in a state of harmony, we need to let go of everything when we come into an encounter with somebody. So this is a poem which hopefully enables us to do that. This is called Meeting Purely in Presence. Let's meet without pretense, without any hierarchies of status or artificial shows of respect, without trying to impress each other with our knowledge or charm or humor. Let's meet without fear of exposing our vulnerabilities, without being embarrassed by our need for love or pretending to be self-sufficient. Let's meet without the past, without letting our urge to connect be obstructed by old resentments, without letting our natural empathy be blocked by hard, fixed prejudice. Let's meet without insecurity, knowing we don't have to prove that we're worthy of each other's affection, since love doesn't need to be earned or gained, but simply allowed to flow. Let's meet without intentions, without any designs or goals, knowing we don't have to try to relate to each other because we're already related, knowing that there's nothing we need to do except allow ourselves to be. Let's meet purely in presence, without any conditions or concepts, knowing that in essence we are the same, and that in being we are one. Let's close our eyes for a moment. Let's relax into a meditative posture, a meditative state. Just for a moment, bring your attention to your breathing. Feel the air as it enters and leaves your nose, as it brushes the inside of your nose. Feel how your stomach rises and falls with your breathing. Feel how, with each breath, you become a little more relaxed. Each breath becomes a little slower, a little deeper, a little longer. And now bring your attention away from your breathing into your inner space, into your mental space. Maybe you're aware of some thoughts, some associations that are passing through the surface of your mind. Thoughts about the past or future, or daydreams. Just allow them to flow by, just as if they're waves on the surface of the ocean. Just watch those waves of thought flowing by. Aware that you are the observer of those thoughts. Let's go beneath those waves of thought, almost as if you're a diver, falling below the surface of the ocean into your deep inner space. As soon as you go beneath the surface of your mind, you're in the midst of quietness and stillness, just like a diver who dives into the stillness, the quietness of the deep water. So just allow yourself to fall deeper into your inner space, away from the surface of your mind, away from thoughts and concepts, down into your deep being, feeling the harmony and stillness of your deep inner space. You can sense that in this deep inner space, you have no individual identity. There's just pure consciousness. You can also sense that in this deep space, in this pure consciousness, we are all interconnected. It's the same pure consciousness which flows through all of our beings, like a channel, like channels from the same source. Let's feel or sense that deep connection between us all in this moment. With the same pure consciousness flowing through all of our beings, bringing us into oneness. Now, Return your attention to your breathing for a moment. Maybe you can sense that your breathing is even slower and deeper than it was before. After your next breath, let's open our eyes again and bring this meditation to a close. Have a brief look around your room and notice that maybe the objects around you look a bit different now after your meditation. Often when I finish the meditation, I notice that everything looks more kind of vivid and brighter. And I find myself noticing patterns, which are always there, but for some reason I don't normally notice them, but I notice kind of interesting patterns on the wall, on t-shirts or cups. So hopefully that was a meditation which enabled you to sense the essential interconnection which all human beings share. But as I said earlier, many human beings lose that sense of connection to each other and that sense of connection to the world. And that's when suffering and discord and discontent enter into human life. What I'd like to do in the first part of the talk is to explain the link or connection, you could say, between disconnection and human suffering, and even what we call human evil. In my view, all of the behavior that we categorize as evil, all of the brutality and cruelty and conflict, that all stems from disconnection. And I'll explain what I mean by that now. And later on in the talk, we'll explore connection in more detail. We'll explore oneness and goodness in more detail. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides now to begin our discussion. So hopefully you can see those slides. So this is my book, Disconnected. And I begin the book with a letter, which you can hopefully see on the screen. This was a letter that was written in 1939, July 1939, as you can see, from Mahatma Gandhi. So Gandhi was in India at that time, and he was aware of the dangerous situation that was developing in Europe. He was aware that a new world war may be imminent. He decided to write to Adolf Hitler, who was obviously in Germany at the time. And I think the reason why Gandhi decided to write to Hitler was because Gandhi had actually met Mussolini a few years earlier in Rome. Mussolini was he proclaimed that he was an admirer of Gandhi's, mainly because of Gandhi's opposition to the British Empire. So I think Gandhi probably thought that Hitler was aware of his activities too, was maybe even an admirer of his. So he decided to write to Hitler to try to persuade him to, desist from his aggressive activities. He said, "It is quite clear today that you are the one person in the world who can prevent a war which may reduce humanity to the savage state. Must you pay that price for an object, however worthy it may appear to you to be? Will you listen to the appeal of one who has deliberately shunned the method of war, not without considerable success?" Nobody knows whether this letter arrived with Adolf Hitler, but obviously it had no effect. Just a couple of months later, the Second World War began, and just a few months into the war, Gandhi decided to write to Hitler again. He wrote a more kind of impassioned plea, a sort of more angry and impassioned plea for him to stop the war. But obviously, nobody knows if Hitler read these letters, and obviously they had no effect. But the reason why I think these letters are interesting and significant is not just because they were letters between two very significant historical figures. It's because Hitler and Gandhi, in my view, represent two opposing poles of human nature. Hitler was somebody who was obviously incredibly psychologically disordered, somebody who was completely disconnected, as I would say. He was somebody who could form no emotional connections to other human beings. He was somebody who was completely isolated within his own mental space, somebody who was completely obsessed with his own goals, which by extension became the goals of Nazi Germany. And it didn't matter to him if millions of people died in his attempt to achieve his goals. Hitler was also, he was probably somebody who took pleasure in witnessing other people's suffering, somebody who was paranoid and as I say, probably a disconnected psychopath. Whereas Gandhi was somebody who represented an ideal of pure, selfless spirituality. He wasn't a perfect person, as he admitted himself, but he represented an ideal whereby a person is willing to sacrifice their own well-being for the sake of universal principles of justice. And Gandhi, as you probably know, he undertook several fasts, public fasts, where he came close to death in order to stop conflict in India. And as you know, he sacrificed his own well-being for the sake of the struggle to make India independent. And he was obviously a very spiritually developed person who had no sense of separateness. He felt so much empathy and compassion for his fellow human beings that he was willing to sacrifice his own well-being and even his own life. So this is the model which I describe in my book. It's the continuum of connection. And it moves from a state of extreme disconnection, which Hitler represents. And in traditional mainstream psychology, extreme disconnection is described in terms of disorders like psychopathy or narcissistic personality disorder. And this is where, extreme cruelty and brutality stem from. And on the other hand, on the other side, we have the domain of spirituality, which is intense connection, which Gandhi represents. And this is where pure spirituality or mysticism, spiritual experiences, all of these stem from an intense state of connection. And this is where empathy and altruism are located. And most human beings are probably somewhere in the middle. Most human beings are fortunately not psychopaths, but most human beings are also not enlightened. Psychiatrists or psychologists normally say that around 0.5% or maybe 1% at the most of people have psychopathic traits. And I think it's probably the same for people who are enlightened or awakened. I think maybe it's 0.5 or 1%, something along those lines. But as I say, most of us are in the middle, but when we talk about human development or moral development or spiritual development, it means that we move further along this continuum. It means that we move further along the continuum of connection towards a state of intensified connection. That's what spiritual development is. I think of spiritual paths as essentially paths of connection, which enable us to develop greater empathy and which allow our behavior to become more altruistic and more selfless. So when people are disconnected, they live in a state of extreme self-absorption. They don't care about other people. They don't care about other people's needs or other people's well-being. All that matters to them is the achievement of their own ambitions and desires. So they're happy to manipulate others, to exploit others, to deceive others. And because they are so disconnected, they don't have normal human emotions like guilt or embarrassment. That makes them attractive to ordinary people who are in the middle of the continuum of connection. they sometimes feel attracted by people who are extremely ruthless and people who are free of guilt, because these people project a kind of strength and confidence. They can also be quite charming, even charismatic. They cultivate charm and charisma as a way of manipulating other people. But one of probably the most significant trait of these people is that because they are so separate, so disconnected, they feel that something is lacking. They feel incomplete. So they're driven by an obsessive need to accumulate power, wealth, fame, or attention, just to try to compensate for their sense of lack. So they're always trying to gain more power, more wealth, to try to compensate for this sense of incompleteness. Unfortunately, it never works. No matter how much power, no matter how much wealth they gain, they never attain any sense of wholeness or contentment. In fact, they actually become more discontented. So these people tend to end their lives in a state of extreme frustration, and they tend to behave in a very destructive way, all because they feel this tremendous, powerful sense of lack. And this leads me to this is a concept which Gloria highlighted in the video about this session, about this talk. She highlighted the concept of pathocracy. And I sometimes ask people, well, let me ask you, I'll ask you this now. Let me just go back to the previous slide. If you were, imagine that you were, we call them in England careers advisors. Are they called the same in the US, careers advisors? Anyway, the people who advise college students or high school students. Yeah.
Yeah. Career counseling.
Future careers. So if you were a careers advisor and you had to advise a hyper disconnected person about their future career, about what avenue they should take in the world, what would you advise them? What would be the career most suitable for these people? This is slightly, I'm not being entirely serious here, because if a careers advisor did recognize that somebody had these traits, then he or she would be quite concerned. But there are certainly certain careers which these people tend to gravitate towards. Any ideas?
Well, I know the answer, so I'm not going to say anything yet.
Well, the President of the United States.
Yeah.
President of the United States. Yeah, that's or of Great Britain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, traditionally, these people, they tend to gravitate towards criminality in some form. If they're from a kind of lower socioeconomic status with a lack of education or lack of opportunity, they tend to become sort of standard traditional criminals, hardcore criminals, maybe gangsters or drug dealers. But career criminals who'll spend most of their lives as criminals, who may be in and out of prison. But if they are from a more kind of privileged background with education, they sometimes enter the corporate world. They sometimes gravitate to the higher levels of the corporate world, like HEOs, CEOs. So you find many examples of corrupt, ruthless, even psychopathic CEOs who, manipulate others and recklessly spend other people's money and destroy other people's livelihoods and even other people's lives. But this takes us back to pathocracy. Yeah, somebody mentioned the President of the United States. These people are also strongly drawn to politics, which leads us to the concept of pathocracy. This was devised by a Polish psychologist called Andrew Lobachevsky, who had the misfortune to spend his early life, first of all, under the Nazi occupation of Poland, and then under the Soviet rule of Poland, when Poland was ruled by a puppet communist regime, which answered to Stalin in Russia. So he experienced two, what he called pathocracies, two governments which were made up of psychopathic people, people who had no empathy or conscience, irresponsible, manipulative, ruthless people. So he wanted to understand why such people are drawn to positions of power. And he wanted to understand why ordinary people, some ordinary people, actually admire these psychopathic figures in positions of power. So he coined the term pathocracy to describe a government which is made up of psychologically disordered people who hold power over a nation of ordinary people. And Lobachevsky also said that there's a process which occurs once a psychopathic person establishes himself, and it is usually men, unfortunately. Once a psychopathic person establishes himself as a leader figure, there's a process which takes place whereby the whole government becomes, comprises of similarly disordered people. So first of all, the psychopathic leader, he is attractive, he projects charisma and charm, and other people are attracted by the opportunities to gain power themselves. And that means other psychopathic people are attracted to the opportunity to gain power, whereas moral and responsible people gradually fall away from the government. They're either ejected or they resign because they're disgusted by the corruption and irresponsibility of the government. So eventually, quite quickly, a whole government consists of similarly disordered people who then attempt to project their values or their psychopathic traits onto the rest of the population. That happened obviously in Nazi Germany. It's happened in many other countries. It happened here in the UK. And I'm not sure how much you know about the UK, but in recent years we've had a pathocracy led by a guy called Boris Johnson, who was, definitely had sociopathic or psychopathic traits or some kind of narcissistic personality disorder, and he attracted similarly disordered people. So the government became quite quickly corrupt, irresponsible, and fortunately, another thing which Lobachevsky said is that pathocracies usually don't last for a long time because most ordinary people are actually moral and empathic. It's only a minority of people who lack empathy. So eventually, even though at first they may be attracted by the apparent charisma of psychopathic leaders, eventually ordinary people become disgusted by the corruption and irresponsibility and even the incompetence of these people in power. So eventually they turn against them. And that's fortunately happened here in the UK. And you can see a similar scenario playing out in other countries too. It's not for me as a British citizen. I don't feel qualified to speak about US politics. But you can draw your own conclusions.
Yes.
So if you look back at the 20th century, it was effectively the century of pathocracy. So many governments around the world were ruled by psychopathic people, destructive people who waged wars and inflicted massive amounts of misery on their own populations. There are just some examples who you can probably recognize: Stalin, Hitler, Chairman Mao. The person on the right in the middle is Idi Amin of Uganda. He's a typical example of an African dictator. Africa was unfortunately full of pathocracies in the 20th, especially in the later 20th century, in the post-colonial era. Fortunately, now the situation has improved somewhat in Africa over the last 20 years or so. Africa has become more democratic and dictators have become less powerful. And at the bottom, we've got Mussolini and Franco of Spain. So when these people gain power and establish governments, they often behave in a way that we associate with fascism. This is essentially what fascism is. Fascism is not really a coherent political philosophy. It's really just a term which describes the behavior of hyper-disconnected people in positions of power, people who have no responsibility or morality or empathy and inflict conflict and destruction on their own countries and in the wider world. But let's now move to the more positive side of the continuum of connection. I mentioned earlier that I just mentioned that fortunately only a minority of people are, become psychopathic leaders. Only a minority of people lack empathy and responsibility, any sense of responsibility or conscience. Most people do have a sense of morality and empathy, which is why pathocracies don't last for a long time. So I'd like to move on to discuss our own experiences now. I've always been fascinated by altruism because altruism to me represents something incredibly significant about human beings. And a lot of philosophers and scientists are quite skeptical about altruism. A lot of scientists think that altruism should not really exist because they believe that human beings are essentially selfish and competitive. They believe that we consist of genes which only care about replication and reproduction. So why should we help other people if it's not in our own interests? Surely all we really care about is, improving our own position, satisfying our own desires. But that's why altruism is so significant, because it suggests a different view of human nature. And so I want you to think for a moment, and I want you to think about two situations. I want you to recall a situation when you acted with kindness towards another person, or when you performed, any act of generosity or altruism. Also, I'd like you to recall a situation when somebody did the same towards you, when somebody acted with kindness towards you, helped or supported you in some way. So there's two things to think about there. When you were an actor or the performer of an altruistic act, or when you were the recipient of an altruistic act. So I'll give you a moment to ponder over that, and you can, once you've thought of something, you can maybe type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and describe it. Describe one of those acts. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. So hopefully you've thought of something now. I'll start the ball rolling, actually. I think it was a couple of mornings ago. I was about to have a shower, and I noticed a spider in my bathtub. So obviously, some people have a phobia of spiders, but I don't mind spiders. I actually quite like spiders. So I had no desire to inflict suffering on the spider or to endanger its life. So I gently cajoled the spider onto a piece of paper and carried it downstairs and let it out of the front door. Mm-hmm. So essentially, I potentially saved the spider's life. Anybody? Oh, here's Rose has mentioned this morning. On my way to Starbucks for a treat, saw a homeless woman and gave her a $5 bill for her coffee too. Lovely. That's great. Thank you. Anybody else like to describe an altruistic act?
Yes. I'm not a very fast typist, so I will hopefully make this brief. Yeah, maybe 10 years ago, I saw a woman in the distance walking in a city park. I live in the city, struggling with a very large bag. And I remember thinking, okay, she's obviously having trouble. I will help her when I get closer. As I got closer, I saw that she was homeless.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, wow, she's homeless. And then I thought, but wait a minute, she's still a woman, and she's a woman, an older woman struggling with a bag. So I helped her. She was kind of surprised, and I was walking to work. And so I carried it maybe 10 or 12 blocks. And then I had to go into, where I was working. And I'll never forget the feeling I had and the feeling she had when we said goodbye, because I'm sure I kind of shocked her and kind of helping her, because she appreciated it and she was tired. But I totally felt lifted. It was the most, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've just lived a truth, so it was a very powerful experience for me. And, anyway, so that was a gift to her and a gift to me at the same time. Actually.
Yeah. Thank you.
Helpers high.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Helpers high.
Oh, Carol says, I drove to Detroit to care for a friend who had surgery and needed help. I've been here almost a month. I've been the recipient of great kindnesses from friends. Great. Thank you, Carol. That's beautiful. Anybody else like to share? Maybe an act of altruism which you received from somebody?
This was, actually, Stephen, you said possible performance. Well, this was many years, maybe, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago. And I was playing the piano in a group, and it was actually at the performance, and I lost my place. And it was with an orchestra, a small orchestra, but I was so grateful because a violinist intuitively knew that I had lost it, and he played the motif that I needed to hear to find my place. I never knew who it was. It was only a one-time thing. I was like a step-in person, and I just, it was like one of those moments to die for. And it was like that was such a gift that was given me, because it would have truly been embarrassing, and I don't think anyone that didn't know the music would not have noticed. But I just remember thinking, well, there was an angel, thank you.
That's nice. It's nice that you didn't know who it was. It was kind of anonymous. Yeah. Lovely. So is Jennifer going to speak?
Yeah. I just wanted to say I've had so many experiences when I was on the recipient end of something very, very kind and generous from other people. But I also experienced such joy when I can see someone light up when I do something. I have many examples, and I'm so blessed. But yeah. I get such joy when I see someone receive something I've done that's unexpected, that I can feel that heart-to-heart light that lights up. I can't explain it very well, but I try to live that way, and including ants, spiders, flies, anything that I can say.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful subject. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, it's well, to me, it's all about connection. It's about connection between you and the person you were helping, or the person who helps you and yourself. But it's also about, it's not just about this, it's even about connecting to something beyond that, connecting to something fundamental, some sort of spiritual realm which is beyond individuals. Interestingly, there's been research in psychology about, it's been termed elation, and that's refers to the powerful feeling you have when you witness altruistic acts. Say you're walking down the street and you witness somebody being kind to another person, maybe helping them cross the road or giving them some money. You feel a warm feeling. It's kind of like restores your faith in human nature. And that psychologists call that elation, the feeling of witnessing altruistic acts. So it's a kind of, on the basic level, there's a three-way interconnection. There's a connection between you, the person you help, and also between other people who witness the altruistic acts. Everybody becomes part of this connection. But as I say, it's about something beyond that as well. It's about connecting to something essential, something spiritual beyond human individuality. And that's why I always, when I hear scientists or philosophers express their skepticism about altruism, it blows my mind really, because altruism is so fundamental and so true and real that I find it very difficult to understand why anybody would doubt that it really exists. I mean, scientists sometimes say that, all altruism carries some kind of benefit to us. So maybe we're trying to improve our self-esteem. Maybe we're trying to impress other people. Maybe we're trying to improve our reproductive possibilities by God knows why. That's what some scientists say. I think they say that, we make ourselves look more attractive because, people are attracted to kindness and altruism in potential sexual partners. But no, I mean, maybe there are some cases when those factors do have some bearing, like when a rich person gives away money to kind of demonstrate how good they are, or try to, present an image of themselves as a benevolent person. But I think most altruism arises from a pure place, a place of spirituality. And let me just give you a couple of examples. I'll just share my screen for a moment again. One really important thing about altruism is it often occurs completely spontaneously. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's an example this is from my home city, Manchester in England, where I am now. 6 years ago, you may have heard about this in the news, but we had a terrible terrorist attack. 23 people were killed after a concert by Ariana Grande. Mostly children or teenagers were killed when a guy blew himself up wearing a suicide belt. And there was recently a report about the incident commissioned by the mayor of Manchester. And it was a report commissioned into the response of the emergency services. So the emergency services were very slow to get to the scene. Apparently they were afraid that there may have been other bombs, so they didn't want to enter the scene. But in the absence of the emergency services, people had to look after themselves. So the report commented on hundreds, if not thousands, of acts of individual bravery and selfishness. So people were tending to each other's wounds, were trying to stem, to heal others and to deal with their injuries. They were carrying people out who were seriously injured. And, there was a paramedic who was at the scene, and he said that what he will remember most is not the atrocity and the violence he witnessed, but the humanity. He said there was an unbelievable amount of people doing what they could to help. I saw people pulling together, I should say, in a way I've never seen before. The thing I remember more than any other is the humanity that was on display. And this actually happens in any emergency situation. I actually wrote an article a while ago about terrorist attacks, and I studied most of the major terrorist attacks in the world in the last few years. And every one of them featured similar acts of heroism and bravery. People, even to the point where some people sacrificed their own lives to help others. I don't know if you remember, there was another terrorist attack in Paris a few years ago. And there was a concert hall which was attacked by a group of terrorists who randomly started shooting members of the audience. And there was a security guard who he kept going back into the hall to lead people away. He kept going back and forth to lead people to safety. There was just one route that was safe away from the terrorists. And this one security guard, he endangered his own life multiple times by going back into the hall to lead people to safety. And he apparently saved about 300 to 400 people. He led 300 to 400 people to safety, including a woman who was pregnant. And she said that her baby would not have been born if it wasn't for this guy. So, yeah, every terrorist attack features these acts of heroism. But not just terrorist attacks, also any emergency situation. Let me ask you a question. Oh, let me just present you with a scenario. Imagine that you are standing on the platform at a train station or a subway station in New York, or just at your local train station or subway station, and the person next to you has some kind of medical emergency, maybe a stroke or a seizure, and they fall onto the train track right in front of you. And you can see a sign saying that the train is due very shortly. What would you do in that situation when the person next to you falls onto the track? Well, maybe you're not sure until a situation presents itself. But
I think it is hard to imagine, perhaps, but when it happens, I think there's a reflex action that happens without thinking that most likely you would help. And I noticed in your book you have some stories about that, and the people said they did it without thinking.
Yeah.
Which to me illustrates the fact that we have a natural tendency towards altruism, and it's frustrating, for instance, with all the evidence of prehistoric cultures being far more connected and altruistic and peaceful than our present one, that not more is being done to acknowledge this by anthropologists and school, that it's still this linear model of evolution which is being taught. Why science reluctant to officially acknowledge this, the fact that we started out more connected and more altruistic, and we've become less altruistic over time.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I completely agree. I always think it's amazing that this is a slightly different topic, but as some of you have described, altruistic acts have such a powerful effect. They're kind of life-changing, and they bring out such a positive feeling of connection and trust and empathy. I always think it's amazing that at schools we don't encourage children to be altruistic, and we don't teach altruism to children and encourage them to go out and act altruistically to other people. It's such a tremendous source of well-being, for one thing. Anyway, yeah, I can almost guarantee that if any of you did encounter that situation, you would find yourself almost straight away down on the train track helping the person to safety. If you go on YouTube and you Google, you put in the search engine, man saves person who has fallen off a train platform or a subway platform, you'll find lots of examples from around the world. It's very, very common, because it's not uncommon for people to have that kind of incident at train stations, to fall off the platform. So there are numerous videos of people acting altruistically in that way. And the important thing about it is that it is completely spontaneous. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody stops to think, what should I do? Should I jump down on the track? They don't even think about it. They just jump down without realizing. If you did think about it, that's when you think, maybe I shouldn't do it, because maybe it'll be risky. But fortunately, there is this spontaneous altruism which manifests itself and brings out these heroic acts. There was a great example from the New York subway, which you'll probably find on YouTube, or Google from a few years ago when a guy jumped down on the train track to save somebody, but it was, in a way, it was too late because he could see the train coming. The train was so close that he realized he couldn't get back onto the platform. So what he did was he pressed the person down into the ditch between the lines, and he lay on top of him. And fortunately, the train just passed over their heads, so they both survived.
Yeah.
I think that was reported quite widely at the time.
It was amazing.
Yeah. But as I say, there are lots of similar incidents. There's a really nice video from London a few years ago where a bus and a cyclist had an accident with a bus, and his leg was trapped under the wheel of the bus. So within a short space of time, 100 people had gathered around the bus, and they all lifted the bus so the cyclist could free his legs, and that probably saved his life because he was losing blood quite quickly. So yeah, to me, this is evidence that human beings are, as somebody mentioned, are naturally altruistic, because these acts of heroism are so instinctive and so spontaneous. They emerge from a deep place inside us, a place beyond our minds. I think it shows that selfishness and even cruelty emerge from the level of the mind, the ego, if you like, whereas altruism emerges from another place, a deeper place beyond the ego. I think fundamentally altruism arises from empathy. And there's even a theory in psychology called the empathy altruism hypothesis, which is that a sense of empathy evokes the motivation to help. So it doesn't matter, even if you do get a good feeling from helping somebody, even if you do impress other people, even if it improves your reproductive possibilities, that's not why you do it. You do it because you have this pure empathic connection with others, which encourages you to help them. And this takes us into the realm of spirituality. As I mentioned earlier, I think spirituality is essentially about connection. If you look into reports of spiritual experiences, or you ponder over your own spiritual experiences, you could explain them in terms of connection. You could call them connection experiences. They're about transcending your sense of separation, connecting with nature, with other people, and also connecting with your own deeper being. And in the same way, you could say that spiritual development is about increasing connection, gradually becoming less selfish, more altruistic, more concerned for others. And that's why all spiritual traditions, they all recommend altruism both as a spiritual practice. They recommend service as a spiritual practice, but also they recognize that when you do act altruistically, it emerges from your sense of connection. So altruism is both the source of spirituality, and it is also the result of spirituality. So you could think of any spiritual path like Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, the Kabbalah, whatever. It's essentially a path of connection, a path which takes you beyond separateness, beyond selfishness, towards an increasing sense of empathy and compassion towards others, or towards the whole of the world. That's why we began the session by speaking about some of the cruelty which arises from separateness, some of the political leaders who are extremely disconnected people. We talked about how disconnection can lead to suffering and criminality. But no matter how powerful and destructive those people can be, and no matter how incredibly destructive those traits can be, in a sense, it is just it's from the more superficial levels of human experience. Those traits arise when we become aberrationally disconnected from our true nature, which is always in a state of connection. And there's a oops, let me share one more slide. I have a philosophy which I call pan-spiritism. I write about this mainly in a book of mine called Spiritual Science. And some of you may have heard of, any of you heard of panpsychism? Panpsychism is it's quite a popular philosophical approach which suggests that all material things have an element of consciousness in them, or an element of mind. Panpsychism suggests that the tiniest atoms contain a tiny amount or a flicker of consciousness or mind. So nothing is truly physical. All physical things also contain an element of consciousness or mentation. So what I call panspiritism takes that further, and I suggest that essentially everything is full of spirit or consciousness. So consciousness fills the air around us, it fills the space around us, it pervades all material objects, all physical things, including our bodies and including all of the household objects around us. All of them are pervaded with consciousness. And consciousness also, or let's say spirit, I use spirit and consciousness interchangeably, but all living beings, all the inner self of all living beings consists of spirit or consciousness, so that we all share the same fundamental nature. And it's because of that that empathy is possible. You know, when we empathize with another person, we attune to them because they share the same consciousness as us. We transcend separateness in order to enter their consciousness, which is essentially our own consciousness. And therefore, we can sense their suffering or their joy in different situations. So in that sense, altruism is completely natural, whereas selfishness is aberrational. Brutality is aberrational. It's a bit like, you know, if you have a feeling of discomfort or pain in your own body, you feel the impulse to alleviate it in some way. And it's the same when another person is undergoing discomfort or is in a state of suffering. You feel the same impulse to alleviate their suffering because you share the same being as them. It's the same consciousness which is inside them. And there are a couple of really beautiful quotes here. The first one is from a philosopher called Schopenhauer, a German philosopher. And he wrote a really nice essay called On the Basis of Morality. And he asked the question, you know, why are we instinctively moral people? Why are we instinctively altruistic? And he said, my own inner being exists in every living creature as truly and immediately as in myself. This realization is the ground of compassion, whose expression is in every good deed. So Schopenhauer said that ultimately, we are not millions of different human beings living different lives. Ultimately, there is only one life. We are all manifestations of the same one consciousness. And that enables us to act morally and altruistically. Well, here is a very beautiful quote from a Spanish Jewish mystic called Cordovero. He said, in everyone there is something of his fellow man. Therefore, whoever sins injures not only himself, but also that part of himself which belongs to another. He said, it is important to love others because the other is really oneself.
Steve?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I'm just pausing.
Okay. May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Interrupt your talk. Assuming, as I do and as you do, that we are naturally altruistic, fundamentally connected, perhaps you could talk about what happens and why people become disconnected
Yeah.
and up to pathological.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I was going to mention that. It's because I think all human beings are born connected, and therefore all human beings are born good, you know, with the natural desire to be altruistic. But unfortunately, I think there are two things. Partly in some societies, there is a general orientation towards disconnected traits. There's kind of like an atmosphere of disconnection within the society. I mean, I have a chapter about societies in my book. You can classify societies as disconnected or connected. Some societies in the world are so disconnected, they are essentially psychopathic societies with very high levels of injustice and hierarchy and, you know, very brutal punishments, very low status for women and so forth. So if you are born into one of these societies, you are conditioned to become disconnected. You know, you are brought up to become disconnected. So your natural altruism is eroded by the social environment and the values of your society. But there's also, you know, when people become extremely disconnected, I call them hyper disconnected, like the people we talked about earlier, the people who become fascist dictators, the people who become corrupt HEOs in corporations. If you look into the background of those people, they have a very common pattern. They have a pattern of childhood trauma and even abuse. They usually suffer from a lack of attachment or emotional connection to their parents, particularly to their mothers in early life. So when people go through trauma, or when they experience emotional deprivation during childhood, they instinctively disconnect themselves. I mean, not always, you know, some people, you know, do not respond in this way, but in some cases, people respond to that trauma and deprivation by creating a kind of armor around themselves. They switch off their capacity for empathy as a kind of defense mechanism. They break their connection to other people. And as a result, they become, you know, psychopathic in later life. So I think that's the essential, you know, the common pattern in people who become hyper disconnected.
So they feel a tremendous lack, which they need to fill, right?
Yeah, once they disconnect themselves, once they switch off their capacity for empathy, then they feel a tremendous sense of lack, which they need to fill with power or wealth or attention.
Yeah.
Here in the UK, there's I'm not sure if you have the same syndrome in the US, but a lot of people, the kind of people who enter politics in the UK are often from a very privileged background. They go to private schools, usually boarding schools, then they go to elite universities and straight into politics, or, you know, eventually into politics. But there's a syndrome when people are taken away from their parents at a young age and sent to boarding schools. That in itself can be very traumatic, and that leads to disconnection. And that's why so many British politicians are, you know, narcissists and people with psychopathic traits, because they come from this background of, you know, boarding schools and the trauma of being taken away from their parents at a young age.
Well, it's also, you know, as you point out in your book, it's also a question that these people who are hyper disconnected have a strong tendency to crave the power and attention that politics gives them, and people who are connected don't really gravitate towards those positions, and so they are wide open for, the people who want them the best. But I love in the last part of your book, the solutions or possible solutions that you propose to, based in indigenous cultures and how they go about choosing leadership and choosing making decisions on different issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that a lot of anthropologists, a lot of school curriculums have this idea that human societies have made a kind of linear progress, and that history has been a kind of progression from an early kind of savage state towards more and more civilization. But in some ways, it's the opposite of that. In some ways, many indigenous cultures were superior or more sophisticated than modern day cultures. And certainly in terms of politics, that's the case, because anthropologists now agree that the earliest human societies were very egalitarian and very cooperative. And one way in which they maintained their equality was to ensure that alpha males or dominant people would not get into positions of power. So if any individual showed a really strong desire to take over the community, to become the leader figure, they would be ostracized from the community. They would be forced to leave, or the community would move away from that person. So that they were very aware of the danger of their egalitarian culture being disrupted by, power-seeking people. They also rotated leadership positions according to situations, and people would not volunteer to be leaders. They would be chosen by the whole group. So you should be the leader. You've got experience and wisdom. So it would not be a person. I mean, part of our problem is that we allow leaders to choose themselves. Now, anybody can put themselves forward as a congressman, or here in the UK, a member of parliament. And as you say, people who are moral, altruistic, and responsible are often not inclined to put themselves forward as leaders. They're quite happy to be on the ground, to be interacting with other people, to be living quietly and simply. So you end up with a kind of disproportionate number of disconnected people, in positions of power. And also, ancient Greece had very well developed systems for ensuring that the politics would not be taken over by disconnected people. Ancient Greece was even though in some ways it was it's quite a brutal society. It was quite warlike, and women had low status. In terms of political systems, it was extremely sophisticated, and much more sophisticated than the modern day United States or Europe.
How did they select their leaders in ancient Greece?
Well, they used nowadays it's called lotocracy, where leaders are selected by lot or random. They call it sortition. Mm-hmm. Well, we use it for jury service, for example. Members of juries are selected at random from the community. So that was the same. They had the same system in politics. And they would have boards. They would not have one leader. Decisions would be made by boards of randomly selected citizens, in coordination with people who had expertise in certain areas. So they were aware that sortition or lotocracy was a way of, ensuring that ruthless people would not take over the government. Mm-hmm. And they also made decisions en masse. Famously, they had mass meetings where thousands of people would gather and vote for vote on important decisions, like whether to go to war, or who should who should be the general in the army, and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I found it very reassuring when you talked about the hunter-gatherer culture, and how they were very connected, and that was it 95% of our history, or our being on the planet, we were peaceful and essentially altruistic and you know, the other thing that, so it's really only this small percentage of our humanity, you know, our being on this earth that we have kind of fallen into. You mentioned 250 years ago where things got kind of turned around.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, another myth that used to be prevalent was that early human beings were warlike.
Yeah.
But now that's been discredited. Now, even mainstream anthropologists talk about, they call it the era of prehistoric peace.
Mm-hmm.
So warfare only really became common a few thousand years ago. Before then, it barely existed. There were maybe a couple of very, very isolated instances, but it only became prevalent about 6,000 years ago, starting in the Middle East and gradually spreading. But yeah, I mean, if you think about it, you know, we've only recently fallen into this era of conflict and warfare and injustice and oppression. So, in principle, there's no reason why we can't return to that earlier phase of harmony. I guess the big difference is that in those days, populations were very small. You know, so people could live as hunter-gatherers, and hunter-gatherers were not territorial. You know, they were moving to different places every few months. They were not acquisitive. They didn't crave for possessions because possessions were a burden to them because they would be moving every few months. So they lived very simply, in a very harmonious, egalitarian way. But now, you know, there are too many of us to live as hunter-gatherers.
But even when agriculture started, you said, now this was something in the book, you talk about when we began to grow our own food and, domesticate different animals, that I had thought, before reading your book, I had thought that was when things started going downhill. But you said we were we were in the agriculture scenario for thousands of years before its patriarchy came along.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, probably about 15,000 years ago, some people began to move away from the hunter-gatherer way of life. They didn't really practice agriculture so much as horticulture. They began to grow things, and they settled down rather than moving every few months. They would grow crops. They wouldn't farm the land so much as just keep gardens and grow vegetables and fruits and other sources of food. So there was definitely a period where people were transitioning to a horticultural way of life. They were still egalitarian. It was really only when people started to, you see a shift when people start to live in towns and start to farm the land with plows, and they start to, accumulate possessions. They start to have leader figures and hierarchies in the societies. Women's status starts to go down. That's when I call it the fall. That's when the fall occurred.
And that
about 6,000 years ago.
And why did they do that? Wasn't it something to do with famine or drought or something like that?
Yeah, obviously it's very difficult to say, but my theory, I wrote a book called The Fall about this. And my theory is that, well, if you look at the evidence, this change, this transformation occurred in certain areas. It occurred in the Middle East and in southern Europe, about 6,000 years ago. That's when it began. And in those areas where it began, also in Northern Africa, there was a major environmental change. What happened was that the land began to dry up. Essentially, the Sahara, what we know as the Sahara Desert, began to form. Also, the deserts of the Middle East began to form. So that whole region became very arid quite quickly over the space of a few centuries due to an environmental change. And in that same period, people began to develop these new habits. They became warlike, patriarchal. Also, monotheistic religions or theistic religions began to develop, which had never existed before. all in these same areas. So there's obviously some kind of connection. It looks like there was a connection between this environmental change, this desiccation of the land, and this psychological change and the cultural change which followed from that. So that's what I suggest, that because life became much more difficult in these areas, people had to develop a new kind of logical, practical intelligence to survive. And maybe that led to an increasing sense of ego or individuality, which led to these major cultural changes.
Did they feel that they needed more land or someone else's land because their land was too arid? That it wasn't.
That's right.
Mhm.
Well, one thing that happened was that people began to move away from these areas.
Yeah.
Because they became arid. So there's this pattern of migration. People who lived in these areas began to spread over. They moved towards India. They moved north into Europe over thousands of years. So you can see it linguistically. All of these people speak what is sometimes called Indo-European languages, or languages from the same root, that suggest that they were originally from the same area. So yeah, there was definitely a pattern of migration, which occurred over hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually see that there's this process by which there's a culture which has been reconstructed, which archaeologists have called Old Europe. And Old Europe was, some people say it was matriarchal, but I'm not sure if that's the case. I think it was just egalitarian, but women certainly had a very high status. And Old Europe seems to have been a very peaceful culture. It seems to have been a nature worshipping culture. But you can see this process where this old European culture is taken over by the people from the Middle East or Southern Europe. These new warlike peoples who conquered them and established a new kind of patriarchal culture.
So that would be peoples that were sort of disconnected, taking over those who had a connection with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think unfortunately it's obviously quite easy for disconnected people to take over from connected people, because connected people are they're quite peaceful, they're not aggressive, whereas disconnected people have this kind of ruthless desire for power, and they also tend to be technologically adept, because they in historical terms they had superior weapons, so that it was easy for them to take over.
Well, sadly, we see that. I was just going to say, sadly, we see that in our current politics in the United States. I mean, technology involving all sorts of media and decision of media stuff. I mean, it's,
Yeah, it makes me think of, because I've been listening a lot. You might be familiar with Ian McGilchrist and his theory about the left brain and the right brain. And when it comes to technology, that's the left brain, right? And it's always seemed to me that, this, what I consider in some ways a devolution into patriarchy that happened, that it was also a shift to putting more emphasis on the left brain. And I think probably it was an evolutionary step to some extent that we needed to develop the left brain more, but we went too far and we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. It was at the expense of, it was emphasizing the servant at the expense of the master, which is the right brain, which has the whole picture instead of just the narrow focus, right?
Yeah, you could explain it in those terms. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. But as you mentioned, I think over the past 3 centuries or so, there has been a movement away from the dominance of the ego and
Yes,
dominance of disconnection. There's been a movement towards connection or reconnection.
right.
You can see that in our attitude to nature. I mean, over the past few decades, there's been a movement, an increasing feeling of connection to nature, and even a sense of the sacredness of nature, and a desire to be one with nature. I think that's an aspect of this process of reconnection.
Yeah.
Oh,
Jen.
Jennifer.
Jen. You have to unmute, Jen. You're muted. Jen, you're muted.
Here we go.
Okay.
Somebody muted me before.
I did, because I try to keep everyone muted if they're not talking, because it's background noise. Yeah.
It wasn't my fault. I just wanted to say that when we were talking about altruism and then disconnection, I was thinking that it's something that's very altruistic, which I've experienced, I think, has been a part of my life, is that I've had 2 businesses and I've worked for a corporation that dealt with therapy, and I deal with animals a lot. And I think one of the best things we can do to be connected is to listen. Listening seems to be in the description of the people that became autocratic and have done crazy things, very insensitive things, perhaps never had listening, that they were never listened to in the beginnings of their lives in one way or another. They were discounted in some way. So what I've noticed is it gives me a lot of pleasure to listen, and I've had many opportunities for that, and I've seen it through the animals. There's a huge movement with horses now that people are learning to listen to horses, and they're saying a lot without being able to express their feelings. And there's also a possibility that because many people tried to express their feelings when they were younger, I'm just trying to connect the dots, that maybe that they became bitter, they became isolated, self-isolated, and that's something we could do now, is to be better listeners instead of trying other ways, maybe.
Interesting insight. Yeah, very
Yeah,
valuable.
yeah.
Kara mentioned she totally agrees.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, listening. Do you have to go, Stephen? I don't want to keep you on longer than you were planning.
I've got five minutes maybe. So if anybody would like to make any comments or questions.
I have one. Actually, I had quite a few, so I'm trying to decide which one.
In the meantime, can I ask a question?
Sure, Rose, go ahead.
Is the poem that you began the talk with in your book?
No, it's in a different book. It's in this book, which is called The Clear Light.
It was a beautiful reflection. I
Oh,
wonder
thank you.
if you could share it with us.
Yeah. I'll send it to Gloria.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll finish with another poem if you like in a minute when I have to go. I'll finish with a different poem.
Okay.
But thank you for sharing that one. It was
Rose, thank you.
interior. It was so touching the spirit. So I thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Beautiful.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Well, let's see. You mentioned in the book that women tend to be somewhat further along the connection spectrum than men due to being more hardwired for empathy. And that made me think of the Dalai Lama saying that Western women would save the world. And I don't know what he was basing that on. But it also made me feel that women in the West need to take more responsibility for leadership, um, in whatever field they're drawn to, despite their possible reluctance, due to a combination of being disinclined to seek power and cultural conditioning and backseat. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, there are more women in politics these days, at least in the US. There are more women in Congress. We have yet to elect a woman president, but yeah.
Well, I agree. Yeah, but it's a problem we touched on earlier, that connected people are not particularly interested in power.
No.
And also, I think there's the issue nowadays, especially with social media, that if you do put yourself forward into a position of power in politics, you become the target of so much, potential abuse, and so if you are a sensitive person, that can be difficult to deal with.
Well, I totally agree, and I think that's a big reason why more women don't. And yet I think the crisis that we are in right now, globally speaking, climate crisis or everything, just the urgency of the situation. Perhaps, one of the problems that I see in our country is complacency and apathy, people just not wanting to have anything to do. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to have anything to do with politics, but I think this is something we have to think about. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, certainly there have been a few really good female leaders, like the president of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. She was a very very empathic person. She was a great leader. She was a good exemplar for other leaders around the world, other potential female leaders. Also, Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, she was in Germany they called her the mother because she projected this kind of maternal, sensible personality.
And the president of Liberia, who was I don't remember her name, but that was a very impressive story about how they overthrew Charles Taylor, and that whole thing. It was amazing. So it would be great if there were more of these empathic women in positions of power, but as I say,
well, I was just going to say in the US, it's been remarkable the number of mothers particularly, and reacting to crises of gun violence and various areas, they have just become the voice and gotten into government on local levels, and I think that really is bringing the maternal, kind of the feminine empathy and compassion and nurturing and so forth value back into focus. But it's fairly widespread, I would say. Wouldn't you, Gloria, in the country with three?
Yes, it is. It's
so there are some hopeful signs.
Yeah, we have yet to get Congress to pass any kind of gun legislation that makes a difference. I don't mean be negative, but we really have, and yet I think that as you said, Steve, there is such a movement in the past few decades towards connection on every level, meditation and so spirituality and other altruism and other areas that I think that once I tend to think that once we reach a critical mass in consciousness, not just in action, but in consciousness, this is what Caritas is all about, trying to reach a critical mass in consciousness. There has to be a shift, and it can happened very quickly, like the Berlin Wall, or, there was a lot leading up to that, but it happened suddenly, just
Yeah.
so. And there have been other instances of that kind of shift.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there are so many people around the world following paths of spiritual development now. There are so many people who are having spiritual insights and spiritual experiences that, it's as if the momentum is increasing. And
yes,
I think at some point we will, well, hopefully reach a critical threshold.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a majority. Critical mass can be as little as 10% or even less,
That's right.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I have to unfortunately leave in a moment, but I'll finish with a poem if that's okay?
Sure.
That hopefully expresses what we've been discussing today. This is called We Are Each Other. We're not ghostly entities marooned inside our mental space with our personal pain and suffering that can never be shared or understood. We're not machines full of selfish genes who are always scheming to outdo each other and only ever show kindness if there's some benefit to ourselves. We are each other. Every human being's feelings flow like air through the atmosphere of our communal being, brushing each other's souls, touching each other's hearts, stirring mutual compassion. We feel compassion because we're connected. We sense each other's suffering because we share each other's being. We risk our lives for others because there is only one life. We help and heal and love each other because we are each other.
Wow.
Beautiful.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Very special.
Is that from the same book?
That's also from my book, The Clear Light.
Right. I have to get that.
Came out a couple of years ago.
I'll have to get that book.
Beautiful.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for
you.
sharing your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you very much. Very much.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
All the best.